Hello, welcome to my channel, Real Estate Redefined. Each week, we bring to you current topics and topics of interest or items that you should be continuously taking care of. Hi, I'm Amol Heda with Keller Williams Bay Estates and author of Thriving Through Ownership. So, when you are in a transaction, contingencies, what role do they play? Role of contingencies in a transaction. A contingency, simply put, is the buyer's ability to back out of the transaction if it does not meet certain conditions. So, here are 3 or 4 contingencies that the buyer can put. The buyer can put a property inspection contingency. The buyer can put an appraisal contingency, and the buyer can put a loan contingency, a mortgage contingency. And in addition, if they have another home that they are upgrading from to the next one, there is a contingency on the sale of that previous property. So these are the 4 contingencies that a buyer can typically have. There are a lot of sub-clauses to these which you can invoke if you think you see issues while doing that transaction, but these are largely the 4 contingencies that the buyer can have. Now, contingency is the ability to back out of a transaction. What does that mean to the seller? The seller puts the property on the market and says, okay, I'll accept this particular client's offer, but it is contingent on that client getting a loan, or it's contingent on that client feeling comfortable after doing their own inspections, whether the property will go or not. So the seller has committed to not selling the property to anybody else. Remember, when the seller accepts a buyer's offer, it implies that the seller will not sell to anybody else, but yet the buyer will have the ability to walk away if they don't like the transaction. This is kind of a little bit against the equity or the equality in the transaction. So the seller doesn't have options, but the buyer has the choice to walk away or has a contingency because that is what they are paying for. Now, remember that when we are talking about contingency, this is exactly what. So it's like a tug of war. The buyer wants the exact same security that the seller does not want to give. Because if the seller only gets the money when the buyer pays it, and the buyer does not want, so it's the exact same thing as pricing too. The seller is wanting more and more money, and the buyer wants to buy the property for less and less money. It's the same thing that happens with contingencies. The more contingencies the buyer puts, the more insecurity the seller feels. And so the seller may not end up accepting that offer with contingencies. And that is why at this point in time, when it is a seller's market, there are not many properties to sell around. Sellers completely lean towards non-contingent offers. And so if you look at whoever's properties are getting offers are getting accepted, the buyer's offers are getting accepted, most of the times these are non-contingent offers. So that. Now, let's talk about the sellers. Do they have a right to back out of a transaction? In most cases, not. But there is one contingency that the sellers can invoke, and that is contingency on finding a replacement property. So say this seller is moving into another one and they want to buy their next property, the leg up, and they cannot find their next leg up, they can at that time back out of the transaction. So that's the only contingency. So then what are the other choices that the seller has when they are about to get into transaction? They will just not accept an offer. So that's a very key thing, that they have the choice of not accepting an offer with contingencies. And that's the reason why a lot of offers again are non-contingent these days. So what are the other contingencies? Every document that the sellers provide to the buyers can be held as a contingency. There is a contingency on reading the preliminary title report. There is a contingency that you can have for reading the HOA documents, because HOA documents are 400 pages plus and they have a lot of information that the buyer needs to digest. And so you can invoke in a even or in a buyer's market, you could perhaps invoke these contingencies too. But most of these contingencies are not being offered these days when buyers are seeing a seller's market or there is no inventory on the market. So, in simple words, a contingency is the ability to walk out of the transaction and go if you don't get a mortgage, or you think that there is a crack in the foundation, or if you think, so that's the inspection contingency. And then appraisal, suppose the property does not appraise to the price. So let's take an example here. Say a property we offered at $1 million and the appraisal comes in at only $900,000. The buyer will get a mortgage on 80% of the 900,000, which is only $720,000. So initially the buyer was going to offer $1 million, and for that $1 million, they would have gotten only $200,000. But because the property appraised at $900,000, they have to get in $280,000 because the lender is going to give you only 80% of the 900,000. So $720,000 only. So the buyer now has to get in $280,000 instead of $200,000. Do they have that much money? If they don't have that much money and they cannot bring it from anywhere, that is a transaction that cannot go forward. And that is why we use the appraisal contingency. What is the way to come out of deal with appraisal contingencies? Either change a lender or contest the appraisal, or go and get a lower down payment loan, like 10 or a 15% down payment loan, so that you come to up with that much down payment based on, so say you got a 10% down payment loan. Then even though this property was appraised at 900, the buyer would get a loan of $810,000. So only $190,000. So that will be another way to come up with that. And then the transaction can progress. And then say the buyer just loses their job. That's in the loan contingency, mortgage contingency. Say the buyer's money was not in cash and they just suddenly put the money in the bank and the bank says, no, we are not going to validate this money because we don't know the source where it came from. That could be another reason the loan could just not go through. So for all these situations, there is the mortgage contingency. So these are the issues that you need to be carefully watching for. So people generally ask me, why does the seller care whether they are getting a full cash offer or an offer with a mortgage and contingencies? This is exactly why. Because if they have these many contingencies, the buyer is able to walk away anytime with their deposit not lost when they have contingencies. If they don't have contingencies, at least the deposit is held back by the seller and the seller is safe that way. Do you follow this? If you have more questions, please click below and check out my other videos about how does a transaction flow, how are offers getting accepted, what are multiple offers, how to contest among multiple offers, and how did my house get sold so quickly? What is a full cash offer? I have done all those videos. Thank you for watching. See you on my next one. Bye.